We have an online speaker who we're going to put up on the screen as well as his slides. So if we can get sat back down, please. Our speaker is Micah McCarty, and he is going to introduce himself. He's going to be speaking on traditional ecological knowledge and ways of knowing. I also want to say, if you were gone while Cassandra was passing out the raffle tickets, she's right there in the red atikvak or kasbak, and she can get you a raffle ticket. So either raise your hand or go to her. And Micah, I'm going to hand it off to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to share some experience and also the culmination of some experience in what I put into this PowerPoint presentation. I've got a longstanding admiration for EPA and the advances in tribal self-governance and the support that EPA has done over the years in assisting tribes, particularly in Region 10 associated with the Bolt decision and what is considered to be phase 2 of the Bolt decision as the treaties are, in fact, environmental laws. And so I wanted to preface my presentation with just a little bit of background concerning this experience in which I was grateful to be a part of when I was chairman of the Makah tribe. And in our experience out in Nia Bay, we suffered 4 of the worst oil spills in what is known as Washington State history. And there's a lot of efforts on behalf of predecessors before me with the vision. And I respectfully acknowledge Councilman Chad Beauchamp. When I first got elected, Chad was very well aware of the maritime risks and hazards to our traditional fishing area. And we look to EPA as a strong partner around water quality standards and other factors that we were working to leverage in our efforts to improve oil spill response requirements. Such actions led to successful language adopted in the Coast Guard Reauthorization Act, and also invites to testify at the Oil Spill Commission during the Deepwater Horizon. There are other factors of experience in which Makah, in my experience before me and while I was there and presently, that traditional ecological knowledge of our people has been impressed upon our technical staff for years. One example from the fisheries program would be Russell Savek and his work with a gentleman named Steve Joner, who had been a fisheries biologist for many years for the tribe. And one of the things that he shared about when he was first getting acquainted with the Makah people is the elders of that generation sat him down and says, "You're a biologist, but now you're going to learn it our way." So I just wanted to preface my presentation with those the influences of those types of experiences in the work that I was involved with, and how the Makah tribe at one time really pushed a very diverse, and still is, I think, managing a very diverse ocean policy portfolio, all of which has been in some ways, I believe, supported in the content in which I have here before us. Traditional ecological knowledge and the ways of knowing. We speak of the living breath of our ancestors that carry multi-generational perspectives and cyclical awareness of the habitats of our cultures in symbiosis with the biodiversity of our territories. This speaks to a tradition of stewardship of our traditional spaces, and in some ways, I would say somewhat perhaps unique in the fact that it is our traditional chiefs that has carried on a lot of what we call the literacy of our territory, just knowing about our resources and how to manage them. Next slide, please. TEK and traditional values relative to resource management, environmental protection, and restoration. I put these together in a way in sort of a contrast or a transition. There's a lot of discussion going on around TEK and its use, and subsequently the Council on Environmental Quality, I believe, White House Council issued an invitation for comment on integration of TEK in federal government decisions, and this was a recent development from the Biden administration. And this PowerPoint actually was developed in an effort involving my engagement and work with the West Coast Regional Planning Body, Tribal Caucus. That organization now is, I believe, recognized as the West Coast Ocean Alliance. Before all of that, it used to be the West Coast Governors Alliance on the Ocean or something to that effect. And this is something that was stemming from the National Ocean Council from the Obama administration on marine spatial planning. And if we think about in today's context with the offshore wind and some of the other factors facing coastal communities, the relevance of TEK in association with regional planners for coastal communities, and the fact that the rest of the family of governments also managed what at the time was called the West Coast Data Portal. And so if you imagine Washington, Oregon, and California all developing ocean planning and all these different things for coastal communities and offshore ocean resources, data portal in the absence of TEK represents significant data gaps for people that would follow the lines of how science informs policy. And so with that in mind, I think of the roots and ways of knowing stem from generations of lifelong relationships of interdependence with the traditional space through time. Traditional and or elected tribal leaders and salient departmental staff are increasingly integrating TEK into intergovernmental processes. Traditionally informed representatives and technical staff have been institutionalized in TEK with respect to program management and development for tribal decision-making, planning, and interface with public policy. This emerging awareness and influence of TEK in the family of governments confronts more people with the notions of standing and protocol to inform decision makers and their technical staff. This is something where in Western decision making and Western science, there's been an inequity of how TEK would be integrated. However, with more and more technical staff and Western trained scientists learning how to decipher or interpret TEK, we get a working knowledge that can become more useful in terms of filling some of these data gaps. And there is a sort of a jury out, so to speak, on there in the absence of like the Western model of peer-reviewed science. TEK means a lot of different things to different tribal communities. And I think one of the things that people have been striving towards is how do we come up with certain common core standards that would be relative to supporting engagement in a way that respects and honors the integrity of the traditional ecological knowledge where appropriate, but also where it could be processed or characterized in a way that can be useful for decision makers outside of the tribal communities. One analogy we came up with at one point was the need for comprehensive seafloor mapping and habitat mapping for enhanced fisheries management, stock structure analysis, and different applications for some species that may have different stock structures but are managed in a way where some underprotected species aren't accounted for, I guess, because of stock structures. Stock structure management is inaccurate. Point being is that I kind of lost my train of thought for a minute. We'll just go on to the next slide. It'll come back. Next slide, please. Too far. Please back up one more slide. Can everybody hear me? Oh, okay, okay, sorry, I missed that. So TK and traditional values relative to resource, oh wait, we already did, oh, technical. Okay, yeah, that's the one that we wanted to just go one more past this one. Next slide. There we go. The paradox of organic systems and Western systems. Internally, tribes and intertribal organizations are increasingly confronted with questions of protocol. Oh, that's where I was getting before. Sorry, guys. Regarding respect and protection of TEK and the sacred, while realizing that withholding such or protecting such indigenous knowledge preserves data gaps for lesser informed decisions in Western processes. Colonial systems of single species management or resource exploitation require a more narrow bandwidth of data for the record of government decisions until other governmental entities are compelled to clean up, recover, restore, or otherwise mitigate exploitive policy. One prime example with EPA. I'll put this into context with the Treaty Rights at Risk Initiative. I had the honor and pleasure to work with the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission and Billy Frank Jr. during a time in which the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission was confronting federal inconsistency with the federal treaty trust responsibility. And the Treaty Rights at Risk Initiative was really focused at a time where EPA really stood out as the strongest partner for the tribes with respect to the treaty resource environment. And specifically in one meeting, I witnessed Dennis McLaren next to two other Northwest regional administrators that, in my opinion, could have learned a lot from the example that Dennis McLaren and EPA held at the time, as being a more consistent treaty trustee with the tribes. So go ahead, next slide, please. And this, as I was saying earlier, when I was first putting this PowerPoint together, I believe it's still relevant today, but it was at a time in a context in which I was involved in tribal outreach and engagement on the West Coast regional planning process. So some current discussions on TEK protocols, safeguarding how we protect sacred knowledge places in ceremonial perspective, family, tribal intellectual property, internal governmental policy, and traditional protocols as sovereign. So safeguarding, that column is kind of more germane to how an individual tribal organization would look at TEK protocols, and this is sort of a phased approach to, how would a group of tribes, for instance, characterize traditional ecological knowledge and its significance in a process where other members of the families of government would also be looking at data resources to help inform specific decisions that may have implications to a cultural landscape, for instance. And so in intertribal, there are some regional intertribal associations and organizations such as the West Coast Tribal Caucus, Range Spatial Planning. There's even more nowadays, with the intertribal space. And again, this PowerPoint was drafted a number of years ago, and it's really encouraging to see more of this discussion advance to the point where I'm invited to share this. And we get to the point of public policy here. While internal intertribal protocols are being discussed, a concurrent conversation is developing around tribal and intertribal standards of watered down or processed data stemming from TEK to inform intertribal stakeholders and other governments. This is a point that I lost earlier. I said I was going to come back to me. When we were looking at the stock structure issues for off-coast on critical and endangered species, certain rockfish species that were endangered, we realized that due to empirical evidence and our own traditional ecological knowledge, the macaw fishing area has a very large biomass of a breeding population that is otherwise considered protected in West Coast fisheries management rebuilding plans. And so one of the things that we looked at is the U.S. Navy has incredible amount of data on seafloor mapping that could be extrapolated into habitat mapping, which could then be used to understand different dynamics that would create an observable environment to model stock structure of populations. And so that if we had the seafloor mapping and then the habitat mapping, and then the other layer of data that we were collecting at the time too was the water quality samples relative to the ear bone growth of these fish. And so we look at the stock structure standard, and we look at what the Navy has, and we look at our own science for otolith forensics. We were on a pathway. I'm not sure if we've succeeded since I've left the table, but we were on a pathway to further refine the improvement of fisheries management. But one of the obstacles that we were facing with the seafloor mapping aspect of this was that the Navy's data on seafloor maps was highly classified. And so the insane amount of data that the Navy is in possession of could be an incredible resource for improving both conservation efforts and also fisheries management practices. And the question that we came up with is that would it be feasible, and this was a question that we believe is transferable to how to process TEK for the protection and use in public policy. And the example would be, is the Navy authorized, or what would it take for the Navy to be authorized to process seafloor data to a level that would be made useful to fisheries managers, at the same time protecting the classified nature of the data. And so that was the point I was getting to when I was talking earlier on the previous slide. Okay, so next slide, please. Statistical influences on environmental policy and fiscal decisions. Since the beginning of tribal self-governance, compacting, or self-administration of federal programs, tribal governments have been integrating more cultural values with the various functions of government and assertion of the value of TEK concerning program funding and tribal consultation. I think the advent of self-governance was one of those mechanisms in funding tribal programs where tribes were able to use our localized knowledge to a better effect. I think that's on one hand, and TEK is certainly, with advances in the diversification of tribal programs, certainly integration of EPA programs since before the Bolt decision, tribal organizations have grown with a level of sophistication and whatnot. TK has many forms and many meanings, from seasonal practices of family traditions to tribal and intertribal programs and policy development around food sovereignty, data sovereignty, climate change preparedness, and the growing TEK interface with other governments presents the need for reconciliation of TEK and Western science. This leads me to another point of caution regarding all of this as well. Because of the macaw whaling issue, it is so emotionally charged for some people. There are Western trained scientists, for instance, that have such strong emotional feelings. They present some data, and this is also a fact for some other marine conservation organizations, where they really leverage a lot of scientific data to push a desired political outcome. And so with the experience of macaw whaling, for instance, and some of the conflicts with the Limit Coast National Marine Sanctuary, the West Coast Treaty Tribes, Washington State, we have seen, a lot of reason to have caution on how TEK could be either dismissed or ridiculed through political processes, and how the National Environmental Policy Act would be, a means where TEK would be exposed to people that would be unfriendly to tribal interests. And in the context of this standard, there are other situations where tribal governments, end this public process concerning NEPA, that I believe tribal governments have an equal trust responsibility to the rest of the family of governments to be present in certain situations that directly involve our treaty resource areas, and the oath of office that we take for the people that we serve and their dependency on this area. That it's reasonable to bifurcate TEK policy for the NEPA process, and also reserve a TEK policy strictly for the government to government process that has to be protected from adversarial actions through a NEPA process. Next slide, please. Some lessons learned from emerging TEK engagement. Decolonizing Western science, or translating TEK into terms that can be understood by Western data processing, requires further tribal capacity development, i.e. education, and institutionalizing tribal orientation for Western trained technical staff who work for tribal environmental and natural resource programs. Improving federal government consistency regarding trust responsibility and consultation practices can be enhanced with greater understanding of TEK among non-tribal partners, including further integration of TEK in common practice. I put a lot of context into some of this, how I believe this bears into this ongoing development in the tribal process. I think lessons learned, as I spoke of earlier, I think it's important for tribal partners to be respectfully engaged in the public process. I believe is a means to I think help inform the public process in a way that's balanced and consistent with our own ethos. And perhaps the eventual intertribal ethos on how TEK is to be respectfully handled in a public process. For instance, in a confrontational set of policies, the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary was attempting to muscle its way into treaty resource management, and they started using words around sanctuary resources as different, different definitions they were trying to introduce about sanctuary resources, i.e. sanctuary resources under their jurisdiction, and started using sleight of hand terminology like biomass removal, which is another word for fishing. And then there was a conditions report that the sanctuary was attempting to publish in advance of a public scoping process for a management plan review, with the idea of influencing public discourse on what sort of priorities should be brought into the next management plan. And this conditions report was done in a way that was deliberately averting the tribal ecological knowledge of the outer coast. And so terminology in this conditions report from the federal government not only was addressing biomass removal and the idea and notion of sanctuary resources, but there was clear and specific language that recognized the 4 coastal treaty tribes off of Washington State as adjacent to the sanctuary. And that's completely inconsistent with the notion, or the fact that it was the Makah tribe that invited the sanctuary into designation as a means to obstruct oil and gas exploration in our treaty fishing area. So then we look at this example as the treaty fishing area, the outer coast of Washington State, is federally protected treaty rights that supersedes and predates the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. So the fact that they were attempting to subvert traditional ecological knowledge to advance policy agenda that was inconsistent with our treaty fishing interests caused us to create an intergovernmental policy council where we leveraged U.S. versus Washington with the governor's office, and we pulled Christine Gregoire into the situation where the governor's signature is required for designation documents for a sanctuary to begin with. And so this is where we started taking traditional ecological knowledge and how we leverage that for the protection of our treaty resource interests into the family of governments, where there is specifically through U.S. versus Washington, there was a co-management paradigm between the treaty tribes and the state of Washington. And in the consistent factor around our oil spill response requirements and working with the state of Washington, we leveraged the value of the phase 2 of the Bolt decision, i.e. the treaties are environmental laws. We were leveraging our relationship with the governor's office in those two main prongs I just shared. Okay, next slide, please. TK, tribal policy, and a need to consider institutional review board. The future of TK as a common practice is entering a space in indigenous academia in both science and policy that advances diversification of tribal governance and reveals more interest towards decolonizing the institutional review board practice of Common Core standards in Western science. This is really mainly, a slide that, I think addresses the need to further develop, how TEK, needs to be both further considered in government decisions, but also protected, and also, grooming succession. Since I developed these slides, I've been involved in a number of other sort of climate change related curriculum development, and some of the things that have been coming through this is looking at how Washington State is not only funded through the treaties, the fact that a territory, to satisfy a prerequisite for statehood, requires the ability to fund public education. And the ceded lands that were granted from the tribes to the U.S. government gave the United States government the means to create statehood. And in my opinion, it's a responsibility of the federally recognized treaty tribes of Washington State to hold the state accountable in its own education system, so that we're not only grooming succession for our own leaders and grooming succession among our technical staff to be consistent with TEK, but we also need to groom succession in who's going to sit across the table from us as responsible co-managers under principles and guidance consistent with phase 2 of the Bolt decision, that treaty trust responsibility with the federal government. And how can us tribes learn from these lessons to improve the toolbox we have to work with to get out ahead of the curve from being reactionary to things like climate change and disaster preparedness, but to become proactive so that we can build the means to excel in this whole new conversation around the just transition and some of these other emerging discussions around rapid decarbonization of ocean water. There's a lot of fast tracks right now on attempts to get offshore wind. There's a lot of things out there that's happening right now for good intentions and good reasons, but the TEK factor, tribal engagement, tribal participation in some of these processes needs to be considered. And I'll just restate that I believe very strongly that TEK, for one, needs to be held in a specific protocol relative to government consultation, and then that there also needs to be some sort of intertribal consensus on standards around the applicability of TEK in the public process, i.e. such things as NEPA related processes and or the state processes. I'm not sure if that's the last slide or not. You can look.
It is the last slide. Thank you.
Okay. And my point being on this slide is water quality. I had the honor to sit on the first ever governor appointment to a blue ribbon panel on ocean acidification. And a lot of us coastal peoples know that when the tide is out, the table is set. But in a time of more and more corrosive seawater, that age-old tradition will definitely be impacted on what we can eat from what's left in the ocean. I have time for questions if anybody wants to ask questions or comments. I'm open. This is an old presentation, and I believe this may be the first time I've been able to present it to a large audience, so I appreciate this opportunity.
Pana Micah. Everybody clapped. I'm not sure if you could hear. We are taking questions or comments. If anyone wants to raise their hand, I can bring the mic around.
This is Adam Barron, EPA Region 10. I'll just say I get it's a little bit dated, but it's still a highly relevant presentation, so thank you. One question I was curious, you can speak specifically to the macaw or generally, who is more productive in this space? Western trained scientists who come work for the tribe, or folks from the tribe who have a fisheries background, then go out and train into the traditional Western scientists and come back?
Pardon me, can you repeat that question again? I had to turn my phone off real quick, sorry.
Sure thing. So my question is, we work with a lot of folks who are contractors, staff, the tribe, who are not necessarily tribal members, right? Trained in the Western sciences, and then go and work for the tribes, and then have to sort of gain the tribal perspective of traditional practices. I'm kind of curious, in your experience, is it what do you see as more impactful for securing treaty rights? Is it folks that are tribal members, grow up in a tribal environment, go out and get Western degrees and come back, or vice versa, where there are sort of the folks that have been trained in Western ways first and then come work for the tribes?
That's a really good question. Well, first of all, I would have to place a very high value on the traditionally acquired knowledge. Oftentimes comes without a formal Western defined degree. In my opinion, I think tribal leaders that have been engaged for, like hands-on engagement, and tribal member staff that have worked with technical staff for years, there's sort of osmosis of sort of biological terminology, I believe, that occurs. And I think it's two ways, where a Western trained scientist coming to work with the tribe, I think should be paired with traditional practitioners, in my opinion. I mean, that's just a generality. But as far as to compare, I believe that the roots are strongest from the community that's most directly, impacted and or long-term observation. When I speak of transgenerational knowledge of our territory, I think of how long Makah people have been in our area and how much knowledge we have accumulated over generations. And one of the scientific values in observation is longevity, the long-term observation of a place. And so, it was technical staff that have worked with tribes for decades that I believe become very effective in interfacing with Western trained scientists. And when we went through issue prioritization exercise with the Washington State Coastal Treaty Tribes and the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, their advisory council, I believe we were highly effective in reconciling top issues through a joint issue reconciliation or issue prioritization exercise. So I think people that are open-minded, I think would be the other, winning avenue. And I think maybe a primer for Western trained scientists that don't have a clue about TEK, for them to have sort of I wouldn't say a cheat sheet, but some sort of an intro on translatable values in the scientific community around long-term observation, so to speak, and more of the holistic awareness of an ecosystem space, analogous to sort of an interdisciplinary approach to understanding a space, where some scientists get so specialized in a specific discipline. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
You are, and the other thing that you said in that last slide that I hadn't thought of, I just want to note it, and if folks missed it, is the application of either treaty rights to state institutions or the trust responsibility to federal institutions for that are funding higher education, to ensure that tribal perspectives are baked into hard science education, so those folks that are sitting across the table from in those later contexts are already there. That's a lot of the work that we try to do as an agency, is to build that tribal perspective and through our programs, but I hadn't actually heard that pivot towards institutions of higher education as well. So thank you for making that point.
Yeah, I believe in the pathways to, responsible governance. This education is part of that pathway.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Thank you for your presentation. I'm from Shishbref, and I know tribal knowledge is very important in our lifestyle in the villages. Tribal knowledge, tribal science, whatever you can call it, ecological knowledge. That's what kept us through throughout the centuries. Our parents and our grandparents taught us which herbs to be healthy with, which things can harm your health. They can tell the weather, they can tell the ocean, ice conditions. A lot of science that we have been passed down is important. I just want to stress that.
Absolutely. It's invaluable for the survival of our people and our cultures.
Have any more comments or questions for Micah? Yeah.
I have a question. Has Region 10 collected tech programs and successful stories and data of because of the climate change? And I was wondering if our regional tribal governmental regional entity could help provide successful stories on tech program, because of our life is changing drastically, and I would love to hear about tech programs in Idaho, Washington, Alaska, or it would be amazing if we could hear more about the progress reports.
I really like that comment. I spoke from examples of what I would consider success stories from the macaw perspective, and I respectfully acknowledge that as an example for sort of maybe a repository of case study where Indigenous representatives and knowledge keepers, government, whatever it is, there's an interest in understanding success stories from other examples. I believe that's mutually supportive for, the standards around what I'd consider equal protection under the federal trust responsibility to us Indians to begin with.
Thank you. Thank you, Micah, so much. This is Randy. We met about a week ago at a conference, and this is how Micah was able to come and present for us today. The power of networking, the power of getting out there, the power of attending these conferences. You end up meeting amazing people like Micah doing this work. So I wanted to thank you so much for being willing to do this a week's notice. I appreciate it. And I also wanted to speak to the last comment. And when we're here as our regional tribal operations committee, we are hearing you, we're listening to these suggestions. That's a fabulous suggestion. And that's something that our committee can do, is start collecting these stories of successful uses of TEK. And we can actually, work on that as a project and put it on our website and share that with everyone. So thank you for that idea. And if anyone has any other ideas like that, please don't be shy. Shout them out.
I would, I think in closing, or I know we're getting close to the end, whatever, but in some of my closing remarks, I want to put it out there that I'm willing and able to participate in any sort of future convening over potential working groups regarding TEK, as well as how I'm already sort of becoming engaged in emerging issues that are coming directly from the Biden administration around setting the table for tribal engagement and comment, including government to government consultation with a current effort through the White House for rapid carbon removal of the ocean. This is being fast tracked, and in general, it's a really good idea, because ocean acidification is a direct result of carbon emissions in Earth's atmosphere that manifests in the ocean. It doesn't go anywhere else, but it's we're enveloped inside of an atmosphere, so carbon emissions ends up in the ocean no matter what. And so the idea to get a rapid, to better understand how to rapidly remove carbon dioxide is an important factor, but it's also one of those things where it's happening faster than I think tribal engagement can catch up to. And this would be another perfect example of how can TEK be integrated into an assessment process, where I believe it's imperative for coastal tribal leaders to understand what this could mean to our traditional resources and what potential side effects may occur from what would be good intentions to address a global problem. But these are a lot of really good, smart people in the world right now, a lot of good, smart people working for the administration that are putting a lot of these agendas forward, and there's just not enough tribal representation to cover all these bases. But in some situations, I think it's paramount that some of these issues, not only hit the radar screen, but actually get some attention from folks like us here gathered with this meeting, and people we work for, including the decision tables for tribal interests in the family governments.
Thank you so much, Micah, for joining us. Let's give him another round of applause. I know you might not be able to hear it, but it's happening.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.